Well, it is fantastic to have you here. Welcome, Rachel. Thank you so much for joining us.
Nice to see you. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday. Yeah, so you at the moment, well, we worked together for a number of years at Archivi,
Good.
and the time that we spent together in Singapore and throughout Asia Pacific. And at the moment, you are working with Qlik as the Senior Culture and Talent Director for Asia Pacific there. So, how long have you been in that role, and how's that all going?
So the APAC role, just over 5.5 years now. So going extremely well. We've doubled the size of the region. So it's been obviously a ride. We privatized in 2016, so we're now back to having sort of got to very close to pre-IPO stage. So it's been a journey. There's been a lot of change, obviously, which has definitely been interesting in terms of learning and picking up some new skills.
Yeah, and so for those who aren't familiar with Qlik, can you give us the
Mhm.
minute, 30-second overview?
Yeah, sure. So, Qlik is basically data analytics and business intelligence, and we're an end-to-end platform. A lot of people, when they consider data analytics, sort of see the pretty dashboards, and we do the pretty dashboards, but we do everything in relation to your data end to end. How are you going to gather your data? Where are you going to store your data? How do you keep it clean? How do you keep it up to date in real time? Versus how do you get it into the dashboard from so many different inputs that we have across the platforms that we use to get it into a dashboard. How do you make sure that what you are looking at in terms of your data is what you should be looking at? Because I think a lot of companies have trouble, not because they don't have data, they don't put it together the right way, and they don't know how to tackle it the right way or look at it critically the right way, which is why we also have a data literacy platform. And then, of course, how do you actually make sure that that data starts to work for you? So a lot of the automatic processing, we have workflows across it. So if you've got a market movement, it will now notify you. It will then go and run something into Salesforce and Marketo for you. So again, as I say, end to end, and making sure that your data is no longer static, but something that actually drives your business along with you.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's an awesome technology. I remember I've used it before, and I can only imagine you guys have seen huge levels of growth. And the thing for marketers is we always say like there's the data and all that, but the ability to actually story tell is I think
Mm,
something that
correct.
you just do
Yeah.
amazingly. And they really facilitate
Yeah.
that as well to be like, you have all this in front of you, but what does it actually mean and how can you take
Yeah.
people on a journey?
Yeah. And by the way, we've got this dashboard in front of us. It doesn't look right. Why? Which is sort of more of the important part of it. And storytelling sometimes uncovers that. It's just like when you start telling the story, there are some logic gaps that you tend to find, and I think that's an important outcome as well.
Yeah, very, very cool. And you are
Mm,
your background, you're genuinely global as well. So you went to university or college in the UK, and
correct.
you're
Yeah,
Australian, originally been in
I am
Singapore,
Sydney. Yes.
Sydney, Singapore for 16 years, Japan for 7,
Mm,
and working also, so not just Asia Pacific region as well. You're
mm.
doing some stuff in EMEA too.
Yes, Europe, and yes, partnering with some ex-team members, so CEO plus one, so crossing the global time zone. And that's the strategy part of my title. I actually work with the strategy office on all of their M&As. So you are looking at the M&A. Human resources business partner as well, which is always exciting.
Yeah.
Lots of change that goes on in there as well.
Very, very cool. And so I'd
Mm,
really love to dig into, the I guess the cultural aspect of it, and then the fact that I have conversations with a lot of marketers, a lot of international business people, and we talk about how Asia Pacific is not a country. And you can't just come in here and be like, okay, we're just going to go do some stuff in Asia Pacific. You've got Australia, New Zealand, across to India, up to China, Japan, and it is just so different. And so, like, when someone comes into the organization
mm.
and you're, I guess, trying to help move them and shape them in the direction to understand the different culture, like, where do you start? What do you do? What's your kind of methodology?
So there are a couple of areas that I start from, depending upon what the person, you obviously listen to people as they talk to you, and you get some ideas as probably what pushes their buttons. So there are a couple of areas for me. The first thing is language. Sometimes, we all are very different as far as our brains are concerned. Some of us are slightly more big picture thinkers, and therefore we look at concepts when we talk to each other, as opposed to people who are possibly a little bit more towards the sort of data structure detail end of the spectrum. And then it comes down to things like sentence structure. To a certain extent, and obviously with Asia Pacific, look, we Australians think we speak English. You can talk to a lot of other people who tell you that they don't understand us, so we don't really even necessarily speak the language either. But obviously, everybody else in the region, it is a second language for them. Those sentences are not always constructed perfectly, and I do see sometimes with people of a certain mindset who look at me and go, "I just don't understand this person." It's just like, you're not listening to the message. You're looking at the structure that you're being given, but you need to listen to the underlying message to try and understand that difference. So, language, I think, is a very big thing at the end of the day. The other area that you and I have definitely talked about in the past is the cultural outcome. And Hofstadter is a psychologist who used to work in the corporate world, who put his work together in the 1970s, 1980s. He's a really good place to start in terms of, he talks about things like hierarchy, power distance, collectivism. So, if you take somewhere and two different ends of the spectrum, Japan and Australia, for example, Australia is a very, well, Australia likes to think it's low in hierarchy, but then we don't like the tall poppies. So that becomes a little bit of a reverse hierarchy thing. Japan is very hierarchical. You are very respectful to your seniors. Japan, for example, is a very collective culture. They use, they make decisions by consensus. Australia is very individualistic. We'll make our own decisions and you guys can come along with it or not. We don't really care. And so that power distance comes into play, whether it's a masculine culture or whether it's a feminine culture. All of these things play into how you actually do business in those countries. But to the point of what we're talking about today, how you message in those countries as well, and how you get the attention of people to be engaged with what you're trying to tell them in those countries. It's a very different thing. I remember seeing a wonderful ad in Japan which just had rolling waves into the beach, and it was very calming. And at the final end, all it had was a bottle of Kewpie mayonnaise. Now, from an Australian perspective, you just go, "What?"
Yeah,
Japanese loved it, right? So
yeah.
you got to try and then look at it from their perspective and go, okay, what about that spoke to you? Because I've missed it at the end of the day. So yeah, the cookie cutter approach. I think if you were talking about companies coming into Asia Pacific, I talk about having the present and then having a wrapping around the present. I think the messaging can remain consistent, but the way you wrap that message will look very, very different by the time you get to, put the bow on top of it at the end of the day. So yeah, that's usually the first place that I'll start with people.
That's huge insight. That's incredible insight. I could talk all day about this. Um, and so it's just not, I guess, just going in with that broad brush assumption is the first thing to be like, what has worked globally, and like we're always trying to strike a balance between um, the globally led message and bringing things across, because you've got your economies of scale as
Hmm.
marketing. You've got your corporate team, and they need to be
Yep.
getting the brand awareness and all of that across.
Yep.
But what I'm really hearing here is that it comes down to like field marketing's responsibility to actually be
Hmm.
um, like the intelligence or the education for them
Yep.
to go, okay, if we're in Japan,
Yep.
message can stay the same, but it's the
Yes.
medium, it's all of those things that we now need to do it. And so it's as much as just really feeding information back.
Yes, and educating at the end of the day, and being ready to educate, because I think you and I have both worked in the region, but you and I have also both worked for corporate. And of course, corporate, when people just cross their arms and go, well, that won't work here, that is the red rag to a bull, right? At the end of the day. And they're probably right. And I don't sort of dismiss that. But if you're going to sit there and say to corporate, this is not going to work for these reasons, and here's how we change it, I think you have a very better, have much better chance of getting an outcome there, as opposed to it just won't work here. I think that then everybody's at stalemate and everybody's irritated at the end of the day. I
Yeah.
think the other thing is making sure that you also understand that every culture is different. Interestingly enough, when I moved to Japan, I knew it was a very different culture, and I found it easier to assimilate to Japan because I went in with the mindset of things are going to be very different. Don't raise your eyebrows, just accept and learn. Then I moved to the UK, and I thought, yeah, well, this is going to be easy. We all speak the same language, right? So actually, I gave the UK none of the allowances that I gave to Japan, and my assimilation into the UK was far harder as a result. So don't make the assumption that just because, again, you've got the same language, that you've got the same culture on all levels. That's not going to work either. So, I think a lot of companies come into Asia Pacific and start in Australia because they make that assumption, and that doesn't always translate either.
Fascinating. That's, yeah, very interesting, because you could go, all right, where are we going to look to target first? And you might say Japan. You're like, oh, okay, that's intimidating. Like it's just what we would
That's
assume
hard.
so far removed like that. But
Exactly. Yeah.
then what you're saying is that you're actually lessening, like, but just going, oh, but the Aussies, they're cool. We'll be okay. We'll just go and do that there and throw our thing in. But it's actually it's not as cut and
Yeah.
dry as that. That's really
Absolutely.
fascinating. So how is it then, based upon that? I guess it's the concept of trust. And one of our good friends, Frederick Morallen, he always talks about trust. And you
Mm-hmm.
have to, when you go into a region,
Mm-hmm.
you have to go in there, obviously for the right intention. You have to build trust, and there's different ways that you build trust and all of that. And what's your take on how we do that?
Look, I think again, building trust is, and this is where, to a certain extent, I think everybody's human as opposed to cultural. The building of trust is, I think, important in terms of asking questions. How do you see this? What do you know? Explain to me what it is you see. Explain to me your perception around this. I'll ask you general questions if I don't understand, but I think if you are getting to the point where you're at loggerheads, I think then trying to explain what it is that you're trying to achieve and then asking people to help you get there, as opposed to just telling them how it's going to work, builds the trust environment. It also obviously builds the permission environment as well, which is how we build trust. But if you can get everybody to believe that they're in the trenches together, working the same way, and that is, here's my problem statement, please be part of the solution with me, then yeah, I think that's a better outcome. I think it is also for the field marketers, as it is for the human resources reps, the ability to show that you will educate corporate to a certain extent, right? And that's where you build that trust relationship as well. It's a fine line. It's a very, very fine line. I'm sure you guys have the same problem that we do. Occasionally, the field will tell you you're too corporate, and corporate will tell you you're too field. So somewhere in the between, you've got to show that you will work both sides off against the middle, and that is what basically drives that is, what are we doing for the business? It's not that corporate, you're my friends, or field, you're my friends. It's, look, what have we agreed the business needs to achieve? And now that's the road that we're going to walk down. And if I think either side is off that road, then we'll try and advocate in between. But and that is probably just being very clear about that and not deviating from that is, I'll get some feedback from people of, look, you won't always say yes to me, but what at least I can trust
Mm,
is that when you do say yes, you mean it, right? And
yep.
you're not just saying it for the fun of it. And I think that's an important outcome.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And so it would be, there's, I guess, the standard approach.
Yep.
You have a standard approach where you go into it building trust, and all everything you're mentioning around there, around asking the questions and being there for the right reasons and being this liaison, and
Mm.
what business. And I guess it then comes down to a nuanced approach depending on the country or the region. You can probably, in Australia, um, go a little bit more head on with some of the discussions, and that's
Yes.
okay. But then when you get into some of the more cultures like Japan, it needs to be a bit
Yep.
more kind of diplomatic, and as you say, that collectivism approach.
Yeah, and then it needs to be, if you're going to challenge, then it needs to be with the most senior person, and it needs to be in private. You're right. With the Australians, you can have a meeting, you can be fairly open, and fairly honest about what it is you see, and people will put their 3 cents worth in. If you're in a collective environment in Japan, everybody will defer to the most senior person, go and have a private conversation with that person anyway, and then you can get some other people to pitch in afterwards. So
Mm.
it does take a little bit longer, but there's no point in just simply circumventing that outcome.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's great. And then, so what do you think then from, well, we work very closely together. I remember like the marketing and the HR and what, I mean, it's all about people ultimately. And so
Yeah.
what do you see the, like, how can, how does HR work like when it's working really well with marketing,
Hmm.
and you're getting great outcomes? Like, what does that actually look like in an organization?
So for me, it's an interesting thing. We are saying the same thing and we're speaking the same messages. It's funny. We've talked about this, I think, in marketing for a while. Says she who's in human resources, but we have that internal communications component is fascinating, and it's sometimes really interesting to see how completely divorced it can get from here's what we're trying to tell our customers we do, and here's the messages that we're trying to give internally, and it doesn't match up at the end of the day, or at least it's so completely divorced you can't tell that it's the same company. We may be trying to do the same messages, but we've packaged them so completely differently. So for me, it is very much about what are we telling our customers, and that's what we should be telling our people. Customer focus is a fascinating one, and I think it's one of the best ones that we can have. We will go out and say we will do absolutely everything that we can make for you to be successful, and yet we don't always staff our people that way. We don't always train our people that way. We don't always talk to our people that way. It's sometimes more about, well, whatever makes financial sense. You've got to disconnect there immediately, right? So for me, that's one of the reasons that human resources and marketing do have to work as closely together as we can, because the minute you get that cognitive dissonance, then the wheels start to fall off the truck a little bit,
Yeah.
both internally and externally, by the way.
Yeah, 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 completely, completely. And
Yeah.
then what what's happening in APAC at the moment as it pertains to people and things like, I mean, there's the obvious one that we've been affected globally with the pandemic. Let's park that. That would be an obvious one for us to go. Although it'll
Yeah.
probably come up in conversation. But like
Mm.
what trends are you seeing around interesting things? I guess I'm putting the hat on of a business who is considering expanding or moving into or expanding into Asia Pacific.
Yeah.
Hiring is challenging. You're so far away as well, and all that. Like,
Yeah.
what sort of trends are you seeing around people and hiring, working, and all of that?
Yeah, so I look. I think again we are parking COVID, but of course I think it's something that we have to refer to because it's driven into the Great Resignation, or as somebody told me yesterday, the Great Reevaluation. And I think that's a better word because, as I said to somebody else earlier this week, frankly, I think the Great Resignation was coming. COVID, I think. Accelerated it to a certain extent, but I think the reevaluation of why am I here and what am I achieving and what am I contributing? You and I were talking a little bit before we got on this call about the hamster wheel, right? And I think people have been looking very closely at the hamster wheel and wondering if that's really what they want to do anymore. And
Mm,
that's fair enough, because I think the whole the whole rationale of human resources at the end of the day is this is an economic transaction at the bare bones, and companies offer things and employees accept them, and that balance has been out of kilter in some areas for quite some time. So I think that's a market that we need to think about. What is it that employees want? The other area that we've got is back to individualization. And again, you and I were working together when I started talking about neural diversity. Of you've got two people who are at the same level, they're earning the same amount of money. One of them has four children and one of them doesn't have any kids. The way you motivate those two people could be very, very different. And so if you're going to try and come in and bring, again, we were talked about the cookie cutter approach in terms of marketing. Same thing with human resources. You bring the cookie cutter approach in, you'll get some of the people in the market, as you do with those broad brush strokes, but you won't necessarily get the people that you want. And I think particularly for people who are coming into new markets, that entrepreneurial spirit combined with what could be a more conservative corporate outcome can be a little bit difficult and can be a little bit scary for some people. But you need people in this region who are going to be self sufficient because they're not going to have all of the bells and whistles that you have back in corporate. They have to be able to learn on their own, they have to be able to make their own decisions. So you are looking for a slightly different mindset and a slightly different set of competencies and skills, and you need to be upfront with yourself about that before you go looking. Do you know what I mean? So, yeah. It's a little bit of and this is where we get to the shall we say, the reputation of it's the Wild West because
Yeah,
or the Wild East, if you want to put it that way.
yeah, yeah.
But that's because you've had to choose the people who will, be able to put those things together. The other thing that I would say to you, and I've had this conversation with people in the last couple of years, watch the English level. We're back to the sentence construction. The person who has pretty English may not be necessarily the best person for the job.
Mm,
So, again, be very careful. Obviously, you need to be able to communicate. Functional English will do.
yep.
Pretty English is not necessary. And in fact, when we worked at Akamai, right, we had an office in Japan. English level was huge. Not
Mm.
entirely sure that we were selling everything that we wanted to sell, to be honest with you. So, what do you
It's
want? What are you there for them to do? You need to think about that a little bit.
and I wanna talk as well about all of the extras outside of pay, because I know that
Right.
pay
Yep.
it still is the driver, or
Yep.
it's still the driver. I want to talk about that, so I won't forget it. But you just hit on a
Mm,
point around um, interaction, and there's one thing around high context and low context cultures
mhm.
as well. I
Mhm.
remember having
Yep.
a great chat again, around this. Can you just give a bit of an explanation of how you think kind of that approach works? How just need to be careful is that I'm the way that I talk. I'm very very high context, and I know I'm very
Right.
kind of like I just kind of throw something out there and expect everyone to know what I'm talking about. But then you have these other cultures who are just like, I have no idea what you're talking about. So again, it's the
Yep.
approach is very important.
Yep. Yeah, and that's where you start to find interest, and back to the Hofstadter culture, when you start having people manage other people across the region. That high understanding of that context is very important. So again, if we look at Japan, which I keep defaulting to because it's obviously where I've spent most of my time in Asia Pacific. Actually, that's not true. Singapore is, but
Yeah.
um, Japan very structured. It's a very structured culture. I've often said, if you have an instruction of A, B, and C, and to your point, Rusty, step D is blind Freddy would tell you step D is obvious.
Mm,
Step D won't be taken because you did not instruct for it to be taken, right?
yep.
Whereas if we have a look at, say, somewhere like India, which is very much that sort of entrepreneurial, trying to put it together, almost chaotic experience. And I put those two countries together deliberately because they are the two countries in this region. If you've got, shall we say, reporting relationships, they're usually the two that will be in my office reporting performance issues
Yeah.
faster than anybody else, right? And it's not necessarily that there are performance issues. It is 8 times out of 10 communication and context issues at the end of the day, right? So you've got to be very careful and very aware of how that's going to play off when you start moving. And
Fascinating.
again, we've got a generation coming up who are very, or believe that they're very global. They want to travel, they want to have those opportunities. But they also need to understand that they possibly don't have all the tools in the toolkit to be immediately successful.
Yes, very, very interesting. That's interesting. So it comes down to, as an individual, and then, well, I guess it then expands to your organization as well. It's all in the approach. I mean, it's all in
Yeah,
being very thoughtful and intentful
yeah.
about the approach. And I guess the first thing as well is just acknowledging it is not easy. Like it is.
No,
Yeah.
no, it will take time. It will take effort. I know that we have brains who love to cut corners and make life easy. And we also live in an environment now where everything runs at 150,000 kilometers an hour. And so we don't always feel that we have the time to make the effort. But it's one of those things, shortcuts make longer delays. This is a perfect example of that. If you don't put the foundation in place, then you will be picking up the pieces for quite some time to come, unfortunately.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, it's great insight. And then, just going back, and I can't help but notice the Earth Day in your background
Yeah.
as well. And I guess that is one of the things where the great reevaluation. I love that. That's really cool. The great
Mhm.
reevaluation, and they say like people are now considering a lot more things when it comes to
Mm.
who they're working with, and
mm,
all that. And I think remuneration still remains number one from what I
mm,
understand, but then the other ones
mm,
are getting up there. And so things like corporate social responsibility and flexible
mm,
working arrangements and all of that, like
mm.
where's all that kind of sitting at the moment?
Yeah, so for us, fortunately for us, I spoke to somebody again before the unmentionable of called COVID, and they sort of spoke to me about 3 months after we got into COVID and asked how Qlik was doing in relation to learning to be flexible, and my response was, well, we were flexible before we came in, so it's not been a big difference. And Rusty, you know from having worked with me, I've always been very open about the fact that I don't care where you are and I don't care when you are. I care about what you achieve. And if you need to do that at 5 a.m. in the morning, provided you're getting enough sleep, or 11 o'clock at night, again, provided you're getting enough sleep, then go knock yourself out. Or if you need to sit down at Starbucks, as long as you're not sort of spreading confidential information around, again, you don't have to be in the office between 9 and 5. But to your point, yeah, we spend 5 out of our 7 days in the organization. We want to know that we're making a difference. We want to know that we're leaving a mark, and not just in our own jobs now. So, to your point, Earth Day is very important. We have a very active social responsibility platform. The person who runs social responsibility is also the head of DE and I, and that's where I program manage with her. But for us, particularly in relation to data, we partner with the United Nations. We partner with a lot of not for profits. We have people who go to places like Malawi when we're able to travel for a week to just see what our data does. If you go back out onto LinkedIn, a couple of months ago, there was an article that I put out. We've been involved in providing Qlik Sense apps to prevent human trafficking at a global level. I mean, it's very powerful to be able to say that you're connected with something like that, because again, if you talk to somebody at our level, yes, human trafficking is terrible and nobody wants to see it. But me as an individual, how would I get involved in trying to make sure that that doesn't happen? Now, to a certain extent, that 6 degrees of separation has now come down to 1.5, and I
Mm.
can feel that actually I am connected to making a difference to such an awful outcome. What's not to like about that, right? Go home and feel like you've contributed at the end of the day.
And
So
that, yeah, that's really, really interesting. And so your org, like so Qlik in APAC was it 400 people that
yes,
there?
correct.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and globally 2,500, 2,600.
correct. Yeah.
So that's a big organization to navigate. And sometimes you can also feel um, it is like you are removed
Yeah.
as well sometimes. And so
Yep.
how do you I guess it's a market. It's a cross-functional responsibility to ensure that all the employees are feeling connected to the company, are feeling connected to the outcome as well
Mhm.
that you're trying to
Yep.
achieve, and being like, no, I can actually make a difference. Be it one aspect of the bottom line sustainability, but then
Yep.
also all of these other things that we're doing. Like, how do you approach navigating an organization of that size and making everyone feel like they're contributing?
Yeah, and that's something that we've been working towards in relation to probably our employee resource groups. So putting a slightly different complexion on them. Uh, Obviously you have global resource groups like Black Alliances. We have Latinos Unidos, LGBTQ. We're actually putting one together now for Clickable, which is around disabilities. But everybody has their local area. And in fact, we've been talking about this in relation to the region, and I'll use Australia as an example. Obviously, those ERGs that I've just spoken about don't necessarily have a lot of connection with Indigenous Australians, for example, right? So it's you have the global outcome, but then you have to, as somebody in the DE and I space called it the other day, glocal, and it is the global sort of umbrella outcomes that then intersect with the local outcomes. So
Mm.
we're looking at sort of geographical ERGs at the moment, which would take on board what they find useful and relevant out of LGBTQ and clickable, for example, but then would also start to champion and advocate for Indigenous rights in Australia, whatever it may be that's going on in China or Singapore at this point of time, and then we sort of make sure that we counteract it. Because again, to your point, sometimes with these global efforts, they're absolutely marvelous, but they don't always speak to the Australian or the Singaporean or the Indian on the ground. And again, back to messaging. I had a Women's Day uh, presentation probably about 5 or 6 years ago in India, and we were talking about the fact that one of our best career decisions that we'd ever made was the choice of our husbands. Well, India is a country where they have arranged marriages mostly. So, really, was that what we were talking about? So, again, back to exactly what we've just said in relation to marketing. Same thing with internal comms and human resources. Keep the present, change the wrapping, and get a local area around it so that people can resonate and they can feel connected at the end of the day.
I'm going to be using that a lot. Keep that. So we've got the great reevaluation, and keep the present, change the wrapping. I like it. It's very, very good. I'm just going to have this in the back of my head constantly.
Well, I'm hoping it's useful.
Yeah. No, it very much is. No, I'm thoroughly enjoying this chat, and I know we're probably coming up a little bit on time now, but
Yeah.
I would love to just, I guess, reach a little bit historically then, and say, what do you think? I'll stretch you on the marketing, because I want to know, like, what do you think has been like one of the more effective marketing programs that you've seen for an organization who, again, let's say that they're looking to move into Asia Pacific, or they're looking to expand, anything like that. What have you seen that you really can think back on and go, that was great?
Yeah, for me, again, as I say, we've talked present of messaging. I think there's also, funnily enough, a lot of, I don't know, resistance maybe, and maybe it's cost, maybe it's control, but language is an important thing. As I say, I've talked mostly about English at the end of the day and trying to get your English branding across. But to a certain extent, it's amazing how many of us sort of seem to struggle with, okay, you're going to go into Japan and you're going to brand there. You need to brand in Japanese. You need to brand in Korean. You need to brand in Chinese, and you need to brand all of it, not just a summary of it, because you need to show that you're absolutely in there. You need to get experts in the region. I think that's the other thing that a lot of companies tend to do is, I'll bring my expert in from either Europe or, and people want to see experts in their own space at the end of the day, people who can talk the talk and walk the walk in the region themselves. So I think that's something that you need to immediately try and do, is get those experts up and running, because that's usually been, and those experts that remain in the region, because as we know, a lot of these countries are very much relationship based. They can remain in the region and build those relationships. That relationship building is probably one of the best marketing areas that I can think of. Don't get me wrong, we love having visitors and we love hearing different perspectives, but that relationship's not built when they come in, they talk for 3 hours, and then they promptly leave again. Do you know
Yeah.
what I mean? So that's for me where I see the sort of value hitting the road.
Yeah.
And customers, if you can get your customers on board again with that relationship building, then customers speaking on your behalf is never going to go wrong at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, I think that's a perfect note to finish on. So I really appreciate your time. It's been so good catching up.
Not at all.
Super,
It
super
has.
insightful. As well.
Thank
I
you.
mean, I'm
And
always,
thank you for
always
making me think these things through. This is always fun when we do
yeah,
this.
that's awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. We'll look forward
Not
to
at all.
chatting again soon.
Okay. Thank you. Happy Friday. We'll see you soon.
Right.
Take care.